Welcome to Celebrate the Gray. I'm Steve Wagner. This week I'm kicking off a two-part series on some social issues that I see some gray in rather than black and white. Joining me this week is the Celebrate Story podcast host, Julie Wagner.
Hello.
Hello. Also my wife, also known as my wife. Our guest this week is Joe Gutberlet. He's a friend of ours that we met back in Maryland, and Julie worked with him.
My work bestie.
Your work bestie back when you first started working. And so I'm going to go ahead and let Julie introduce Joe to you.
Okay, so Joe Gutberlet and I worked at a place called SCORE Educational Center. SCORE was owned by the Washington Post, and it was a private education learning center where kids came in twice a week to work on reading, math, and writing. And Joe was such a bright light. And he, as I said, was my work bestie. We had so much fun together. We were in charge of both the sales of the program, the marketing, the parent conferences, and the tutoring. And he was such a light to the children in the center. Like, everyone loved when Joe was there. And I always loved working with Joe because he was such a positive energy that we could stand on the sidewalk and tell people about SCORE and bring in like 20 people to learn more about what this educational center was all about. But then if I was working alone, it's like maybe I could bring in one. So let me introduce you to Joe Gutberlet. He was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. He graduated from UMBC with a BA in political science in 2001. He then taught high school history and coached debate at his alma mater in Towson, Maryland. And then I met him at the SCORE Educational Center we both tutored at. He then went on to work for LexisNexis as an editor in Bethesda, Maryland. And after that, he actually did 2 different stints in the Maryland General Assembly, punctuated by law school. He graduated from Maryland Law in 2012, during which he interned for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and the Maryland House of Delegates Health and Government Operations Committee in Annapolis. At Maryland Law, Joe worked in the Public Health Law Clinic fighting for stricter cigar laws in Annapolis. He joined Laureate Education in 2014, helping to monitor, analyze, and operationalize state and federal legislation and regulations related to Walden University. Joe has tutored high school students for the SAT and ACT and aided with college essays for over 20 years. And he lives in Baltimore, Maryland with his husband, Jamie, who is an architect and who designs hospitals. And they live with their dog and their cat, Miss Adelaide and Goofy. Joe is a ravenous learner. He's a lifelong learner, which makes him just this beautiful teacher. So I can't wait for you to just get to know him over the next hour.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us today on Celebrate the Gray. I almost said Celebrate Story because next to me is Julie Wagner, my lovely wife who does the Celebrate Story podcast. But Joe and Julie work together. That's how Joe entered our universe. And while we're here, one of the reasons we're here having this discussion tonight. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Steve. Thanks for having me.
I have you on tonight because I want to discuss a topic that's heavy in the news now and has been for a while, and I just want to get your experience with it. Joe, you're married to Jamie. You're a gay man.
Yep.
Growing up, as I understand it, you went to an all-boys Catholic school. You were a devout Catholic. Your family was devout Catholic. You had to keep things under wraps for a little while, in respect, I think, towards some older family members. Your father was a Baltimore City police officer or Baltimore County police officer. So growing up kind of in that world, just want to get an idea of what that period of time was like for you to just kind of grow up in that environment.
I remember the only gay characters I ever saw in movies and TV felt nothing like me. They were so suave and fashionable, and try as I may, that's not who I am. I'm awkward and clumsy and mismatched, and I'm lucky if I'm wearing the same kind of socks, same pair of coordinated socks. So I couldn't associate, and I never felt, in terms of identifying, like I could identify with the culture. I appreciated a good show, but I was more, loved sports and wasn't really into music. I've still never been to Broadway, and I'd love to because there's plenty of great shows. But um, as you said, I went to an all boys Catholic high school, and I grew up in a world that I played with all the guys. I had most of my friends were guys, and fortunately, I had very little confusion. As I've come, it took even for me years to understand that there's this whole spectrum, and people have all kinds of feelings. And I mean, I just only had feelings for guys, and I tried. I remember in middle school, also a Catholic school that was co-ed. I remember sitting at home as boys would in my room, thinking about I would even look at pictures of girls. Nothing came to me. I mean, like I was like, why isn't anything happening? And meanwhile, I have this mental image of the boys at school and had crushes, and so by high school at this all boys school, I knew where I stood. I just didn't know what to do about it. So I just kind of kept it quiet. And same thing with family. And I came from not just Catholic family. I mean, it's a kind of Catholic family that everyone went to church and did the sacraments. And I was too. I was very involved as an altar server and then later lector, youth minister for 10 years. And loved it, and fortunately had great experiences with the church. But at the same time, most of my family felt very male oriented. There were a lot of boy cousins, and all of them but me played sports. I like sports, but they all played, so I'd go to their games, and yeah, so I definitely tried to fit in, and it didn't necessarily feel too awkward, but it just I wanted to be able to just vocalize out loud, yeah, he's a good looking guy, yeah, he's hot or something like that. I never did until got kind of to college.
Was that painful not to be able to vocalize it? Because I remember when we would work together, you had shared how, okay, you had this wrestling, if I remember right, correct me,
Yeah,
like you didn't want to tell your grandparents. And
yeah,
at the time I received it as like you wanted to honor
yeah.
that you knew they thought differently. Like, how do you look at that now? Like
I
all this
know. Well,
life lived later.
it was very painful. In fact, we never did tell my grandparents. On my mom's, fortunately, I still have a grandmother on my dad's side who is just, I'm honestly one of my best friends. She's 90 years old, and she was one of the first people I told. Apart from some friends and my mom, but so she was wonderful. But the other grandparents, very old fashioned, sort of children of immigrants, and I don't think that would have gone well with them. I don't know what they would have done, or maybe they would have just ignored it or something. But my mom's parents, we never really told, and they passed in 2014 and 2015 in very close succession. And the painful part was I had actually met Jamie by then, and by the time my grandfather was the only one, my grandmother died in 2014, and grandfather survived her by a few months. There was a holiday in there, I think it was Thanksgiving, and talking to my mom and her sisters, we decided best not to come. Jamie and I didn't come to that Thanksgiving because Pop was going to be there, and we didn't want. I mean, at that point, I think Jamie and I were engaged. He died right before we got married, but so I mean, we went. Fortunately, we had wonderful family friends that had us there. It's not like we were alone, and the other side of the family went there. But I mean, that of course hurt. I know it hurt my mom to feel like she couldn't have her son there at Thanksgiving. And that's honestly the most dramatic family kind of story I could say. I mean, other than had some family, and my dad's baby sister. I was the only one. She's evangelical Presbyterian, but St. One should say evangelical, but conservative Presbyterian, and she was one to uh, try to convince me to explore conversion therapy and things like that in the 90s when it wasn't obviously. Now it's we know just how damaging that is, but and she's wonderful. She had us to Easter this year when we were down in Orlando, but that was like the Thanksgiving experience where Jamie and I just stayed away from my mom's family. That one holiday was probably the most painful.
Help me with the timeline. So you got engaged to Jamie. How long was it? A regular engagement? Was gay marriage allowed at that point,
Oh yeah, that's
or
a
was it
great
in
question. See,
anticipation? Like what? Tell me about that, because when Julie and I wanted to get married, we went down, we got a marriage license, and we got married. It wasn't a thing, So I can imagine your experience was a bit different.
yeah, I mean, we met actually online in 2013. and by the time I met Jamie, I had been on. I'm pretty sure I was keeping track of it at one point, 100 dates. I mean, somewhere I mean, I kept dating a few other people after meeting Jamie too. Just we were both dating and dating and dating. We would meet sort of like interviewing for jobs. And so that was in the spring of 2013, and we realized by late spring that we wanted to be together and stop dating other people and became steady, right? And by May of 2014, we became engaged, and I think that was the time that a lot of I think the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down one of the laws that I mean, at least allowed gay marriage to be legal in some places. And Maryland legalized gay marriage in 20, or I should say marriage equality. I'm sounding like an old codger. In 2012, Maryland allowed it. I know I don't use the right terminology myself sometimes, but no. But interestingly, when we were married in April of right after your anniversary, I believe we were married April 8th of 2015, and it wasn't until that June that the Supreme Court ruled. There's a case called Oberfeld where they ruled it legal throughout the land. So yeah, technically, when we got married on April 8th of 2015, gay marriage wasn't legal. Marriage equality wasn't the law of the land in America. Yeah.
Did that? Did it mean? I'm assuming that it probably meant very different things for both of you. Like, was it more meaningful to you or to your husband, or was it? What was that like? If anything you want to share, like I can't imagine that experience.
He actually had a completely different experience of the whole being gay thing, in that it wasn't until even after college for him. He's 5 years younger than I am, but he has an older sister that's about my age, and so fortunately, our first conversation online was about Saved by the Bell, and our cultural alignment's great, so we remember a lot of the same things. But no, I mean, by the time Jamie graduated from UVA at that point in 2006, he still wasn't really out, and I don't think he had really come to terms himself, realizing he never had, unlike I did, he never had crushes on guys in high school. Or I mean, I think he now reflects back and realizes that he might have had feelings, just didn't know what they were. But no, it was much later for him, and he's not as, I mean, I'm such a political lover, and I mean, he wasn't following the issues as I was back in the day and listening to what Senator so and so was saying about the issue. And but he was, of course, from the heart of Virginia, and I mean, he knew better. He recently had me watch The Eyes of Tammy Faye, and knew all of the preachers, in fact, has some family connections very indirect to Jerry Falwell, and so he was very familiar with them. Interestingly, though, his parents, who are again very Christian, definitely see through a lot of the hypocrisy in that, and they were very wary of the preachers that became big stars. I think they're just low key people, so they sort of imbued in my husband a sense of modesty when it comes to faith, and that like these people who are going around making the news aren't necessarily the ones you want to be following. Yeah.
So since we're here on church, you're Catholic, still practicing Catholic. I know the most recent Pope is fairly affirming. From what I'd gather, I don't follow Catholic tradition very much, but how's the church interact with you on that?
Interestingly, Jamie's the one to break the news the day after our first date. This Pope, the current Pope, was elected Pope, and so I got this text, "Habemus Papam," which means we have a Pope, and from Jamie, and that was how I found out about the new Pope, and I was thrilled because I like, not just a Catholic but a news follower, so I had read up on the top contenders. It's so weird that that's how Catholics do it, but that's what we do, and so I knew this one was probably the most progressive from Argentina, and I was elated. And so it was so cool that this guy that I just met and just went out with for the first date broke the news, and I've been really thrilled. I mean, it's sad to me that churches have of course the Catholic Church is political. It was the government for all those years, and the only one in town for most of Europe. So I mean, I can't say I'm surprised that it's political, but it's sad to me that there's factions, conservative and liberal factions. But it's certainly been refreshing to hear him say things that at least are open-minded, and it's also at the same time sort of annoying. I don't want to say heartbreaking. That sounds dramatic when he makes statements that clearly aren't very progressive. I want to say, come on, what are you waiting for? I mean, we kind of, I don't want, nothing's inevitable, but it seems like sooner or later, what are you left with if you don't welcome more people in? But um, yeah, but fortunately, I know, like all leaders, you don't want to worship the leader. I mean, so appreciate the work that they do to try to keep things together and keep things going. But yeah, don't want to put too much faith, even if I like the leader.
Hmm.
I'll flip it on to the other side too, away from, I guess, the denominations, non-denominational. We're down here in the South. Tends to be some aggression towards LGBTQ, maybe misunderstanding, maybe however you want to go with that.
Well, I this is what's so weird is, I actually consider myself evangelical, and um, I I actually listen to the music all the time, and sometimes I think to myself, well, there's more than music, and I'll actually tune in and watch services of all sorts of it. And I've been to, for instance, Joel Osteen's church when we were visiting Houston. I've been to a number of Hillsong churches around the country when we were traveling, and I love it. And I would gladly be part of any of those communities. And I love going to, as I said, my in-laws belong to a church that I mean, I think even on the LGBTQ plus issue is more conservative, but at the same time, they're wonderful. I mean, the pastor and his wife treat us like, long lost son, not even long lost sons, because we're back enough. But I mean, she always the pastor's wife at the, I think it's the elder minister. I mean, it's non-denominational, so they're little. It's not quite as hierarchical. But Betsy comes up and gives us a big hug. And I actually, after I had a family tragedy in 2017, a very close cousin died at a young age, and we were at Jamie's family's church, my in-laws' church, that next weekend, right after the funeral for this cousin, and I couldn't wait to hear his preaching. So I think I'm in this weird position where I love it. I don't actually think that there's hatred. I mean, I think there's agitation and concern, and I want to say, I wish I could have this megaphone and say to my fellow LGBT, I mean, which is a huge spectrum of people, LGBTQ folks, like we've got to sometimes be patient, especially when it comes to the gender issue and pronouns and so forth. And I mean, I get confused about it sometimes. I think sometimes my husband and I will be like, wait, what does that mean again? What does the I stands for? And we have to like refresh ourselves, because if you don't know people, it's not familiar. So if we could all just have a little bit of patience with each other and understanding, I think that would, rather than shouting and yelling and trying to make everybody see our perspective, do a little bit more listening.
And I know I read something recently that was talking about the better you get to know people, the less stigma there is. It's easier to fear things you don't understand. But,
Yeah.
If you meet someone, have a conversation, just kind of get an idea of what they're going through, whether it in any realm of life, it makes things go a little smoother, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's impossible to not like someone up close, right? Like
Right.
when you really get to know who they are rather than the boxes we put them in. It's like, I mean, I feel like that's a lifelong lesson I love to keep relearning.
As a politics guy, I mean, they always, there's this old cliche that people hate Congress, but they love their congressman. That you like your guy, but you just don't like the institution. And and it's true. I'm so grateful that I have that aunt and uncle that I mentioned. That I know. And I think we were initially planning a wedding back in 2015. We ended up doing something very simple, just parents and Jamie's sister and her family. But when we were planning the whole big wedding enchilada, that aunt and uncle that I mentioned that are definitely on the other side of the issue, we're not planning to come. I mean, we didn't even get to the point of sending out invitations, but one of my dad's sisters asked, "Will you come?" And she said, "No, I don't quite agree with that." That wouldn't have offended me in the least, because I respect that and I love them to pieces. And I remember being so grateful that they were so kind to have us to their house a number of times. And I said most recently, just this past year for Easter, we celebrated with them. And my four cousins there we love them, they love us, and so that's all. I don't care if we all agree as long as we can have a relationship.
Wow. That is where do you get that from? Because most humans don't come to that so naturally. And I remember back in when we worked together at SCORE, you had just this where do you get that from? Is it from Mama Gup? Where does it come from, Joe? Is
I
it
think
easy to get you to that space? Is it like an easy, or is it a hard like choice of like this is where I choose to go, or is it
it
just naturally
totally
how you
is.
are? Like,
Well, and Julie remembers. I mean, the funny thing is, I often say the best part that came out of the year that I worked with Julie was Julie and having friends being friends with Julie, and because I didn't really love that the job that we did there, and there were people that I really, I mean, I at the time, I thought, oh, this person is. The bane of your existence, when you work day in and day out. But now I look back very fondly. I mean, when I visited a country where one of the people I worked under was from, and I was having these fond memories. I think, what is wrong with me? I remember not really particularly being that thrilled with this person, but I guess I'm rosy, and I don't know. Maybe I've been doing therapy of late because I realize I have terrible anxiety, and I've had that for years. And I think I had to grow up really fast. It was just my mom and me, a single mom. As Steve mentioned, my dad was a Baltimore City police officer. So, and my parents ended up divorcing when I was 4. And so, because it was just my mom and I became like the little man of the house, and grew up so fast that maybe I've just also grasped onto this childlike simplicity or something. I don't know.
wow. That's so interesting how you remembered working at SCORE, because the very thing I remember is I would be the one so frustrated with coworkers, and you were just always so it was interesting when I asked the question, because I realized, wow, you're remembering it totally differently. Like, I always saw you able to hold the complexity of who people were as
Right.
humans, and I didn't remember you getting so that's so interesting. I guess we do that to ourselves. We have our own version, and then there's the version that everybody else remembers.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to have conflicting. On the gay issue, in 2012, Maryland actually staged a referendum on the gay marriage issue, as many states did, which really, got my goat, because I thought, how can you vote on such a thing? But we did, and Maryland actually voted in favor of it and legalized it and everything. But they had a petition you had to sign a petition, and it needed like 55,000 signatures or something like that to get on the ballot in the first place. Otherwise, it would have just gone into law. But sure enough, they got the people who wanted to put it up for a vote, got the signatures. And I saw it was a public list, and I saw many people that I know and love, and people that I've celebrated holidays with. It's a few family members, but you just have to be able to see people and all the different facets of people and institutions. And I don't know where that exactly comes from, but makes life a lot less frustrating if you can just look for, compartmentalize and see complexities.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to do on this podcast, is be able to put things in different, not see everything black and white. But you mentioned politics, so let's hop into politics for a second. After you worked at SCORE, you went to law school, correct?
Right.
Okay. And then you did get into politics a little bit. As far as this case goes, LGBTQ plus marriage rights, things like that, I'm a little jaded when it comes to this topic in politics, because I don't necessarily think that politicians should be in the morality business. It really, when as the government is, their role in marriage is really, I mean, it's a tax status for
Right.
and and survivorship benefits and things like that, things that have to do with the law. So when you were, and in your following politics, tell me how you've experienced the relationship between LGBTQ plus and the political realm.
Well, interestingly, it was actually my former boss in the legislature, a Republican, and I worked for a Republican for many years, even though that I've actually been a little of everything. I've gone back and forth and independent, and I mean I've voted even the most recent elections, well, state elections. I voted for a few of everybody. But he was a deciding vote for marriage equality in Maryland in the legislature. He was a member of the House of Delegates, and I I'm a little ashamed to say this, but if you understand politics and all that, and people, he's like a father to me. And just recently saw him and had dinner with him and his wife. And I actually I tried to convince him not to vote for it because there were so many Democrats who were voting against it. I was being so shrewd. I said, make the speaker find more Democrats. You don't need to put yourself out there, because it ended up. I mean, I was right to be worried because people were vicious to him afterwards. He lost lifelong friends for voting for it. He wound up running for local office at county level and won, and is striving there. But it was awful, and people followed his wife around in the mall, and I mean it was so mean. And so I was so worried about him. I said, you don't need to be the one out there on this. And I remember the head of the Maryland's gay rights group came to me and said, we need to have a come to Jesus moment. And she was saying, and I eventually, when he said, no, I'm good with this, I want to vote for it, I supported him completely. Of course, I was thrilled, and I tried to help him craft his messaging or whatever. But I mean, Steve, you're absolutely right. It's just I, I don't know how you can completely separate your values from governing. When I look at all those criminal justice issues, it's so hard for me sometimes to I don't know how they do it. I'm glad I'm not making. Julie knows I love politics forever, and I've decided long ago I don't want to be I don't want to be a politician, but I don't know how sometimes the message of forgiveness that's so pervasive in it's the heart of Christianity, love and forgiveness. I don't know how you make laws that deal with crime and punishment, because where does forgiveness fall in that? I don't know if that's really your core of your morality. I don't know how you kind of separate those.
That story is unbelievable. Like, I'm not knowing you, I'm not at all surprised that you would be begging your former boss, but I'm also like, knowing you and knowing that he knew you, I could see why he'd be like, no, how could he not? I'm just so sad too, just the hurt and I know that this is a widespread, so many people are hurt in these things, which
yeah.
I don't know, I'm losing words, but that's an incredible story, Joe. Wow.
When I tell it to people now, if you're one of the rare ones, most people go, what's wrong with you? How could you have? I mean, I've had many people like, you never. I'm like, oh, it's not so black and white. Come on. And you really have to understand what it's like to be in office like that, and to be a member of a, it's people, politics is such a blood sport. So to know that you're potentially committing political suicide, to be dramatic, I certainly appreciated what he did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's amped up since then. That you said that was 2012.
Yeah, 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's on steroids now.
Yeah,
because we're so disconnected. I mean, we've gotten so much more disconnected and so pulled apart, and
connected by. We think we're all connected by social media and that sort of thing, but the relationships actually seem to be, we're getting further apart, and the pandemic didn't help things.
Yes. And I mean, I'm just as in the muck. I mean, all it took was like one emotional direction in the pandemic that I'm like posting about, and all of a sudden there's 90 comments, and I'm arguing with his cousin. I'm like, how did I get here? This is not who I want to be. I mean, I'm also in it. I want to be very clear. Confession.
But see, I never unfollow people because, I know my husband will do that. He'll just unfollow. He'll get really agitated. I mean, I want to know that there are people who think other things, and that helps me. I mean, and Julie, you're somebody. I mean, I've seen things that you've articulated. And at least I have a mental picture. Like, I know and love somebody who might think differently than I about something, and that helps me. That's why you will ask why I am the way I am. That's how, because I think of the person first rather than the issue.
That's what I hope to be, and I think you do that so well.
We're ideological soulmates.
So where do you think things stand right now as far as LGBTQ rights and just the culture? And I'll tell you a quick anecdote
Mhm.
back to when I went to my all boys Catholic school in Baltimore. The there turned out that there was, I think, from what I've seen on Facebook and stuff, 4 or 5 guys who ended up being gay that weren't out um, in high school. But I remember my first interaction. I had a drama teacher, and for extra credit, we could go to a show he was playing in Fells Point, and it was called Falsettos. And I had no concept of what falsetto might mean or anything like that. So my dad and we hop in the car, we drive down, go to this play, and like I think we came back from intermission. And the first scene back from intermission, there were 2 guys in bed together, like fully clothed, but they were in bed together. And all of a sudden you realize like it was a man and his wife through the whole thing. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, this guy's having it, he doesn't know whether he's straight or gay, and he's having an affair with a guy. Anyway, it was quite the surprise to me and my dad sitting there. And then I realized, oh, that makes sense. My drama teacher, who's playing the piano in the show, he's gay. But so that was my first interaction. So to me then, and that was strange at the time for at least the world that I was in. But now I'm not going to say everywhere, that would be an exaggeration, but it's much more mainstream as far as the culture goes. So good thing, bad thing, overdone, underdone. Where do you see kind of the cultural impact that's having?
I I think it's helpful that more and more folks like my husband and I just don't limit ourselves to um, I don't want to say ghetto. I think ghetto. There is. I mean, ghettoizing is something that people. It's not just something that we associate the common use of the term, but that we live in a neighborhood where I think we're probably the only gay couple in the immediate vicinity. We live in a very family-oriented community. Lots of row houses and children playing and things like that. And I think it's helpful to not blend in per se, but to be part of the larger community because when I was growing up, it seemed like, I mean, this is the reason I was not out in high school. I thought, well, where am I going to live? Like, do I have to live in Greenwich Village, New York or something, or move to San Francisco? And I don't want to do that. I love Baltimore. I love my family and friends here. And so I'm glad that that's the kind of world we live in. Although I'm really mindful that the new front of on the issue is more about gender and I think that the especially the transgender community and the non-binary folks are facing the biggest headwinds right now. And it's so heartbreaking to me because I remember years ago, even before it kind of bubbled up, saying to Jamie, and he wasn't quite with me on this, like, I don't understand why we just don't have one bathroom everywhere. I mean, I grew up with my single mom, or yeah, and I understood that women had periods, and not grossed out by being in the same restroom. It's just like there's nothing sexual about being in the restroom. I mean, I don't like there's nothing that's turn on about seeing guys in the restroom for me. So I mean, face it, like I'm in the men's room, like there are other guys, and I've been in men's locker rooms, like it doesn't do it for me. Like I'm sweaty, I have to poop. Like I don't want to have sex with you. So I don't get it. And I just like, as far as I'm concerned, there shouldn't be just one. But I understand that that's weird to people. And that's why, as I said earlier, like we just need to be patient with people and not scold people if they don't get it right and help people and just gentle reminders like actually it's a they but it is confusing. You're like, wait, who's they? And it's sometimes it's just confusing, and that would be nice if we all just kind of understood that. But I worry about this point we're in because of the potential for backlash. If you're sometimes if you push too hard, people end up pushing back really hard, and it could go to a place that we don't want it to be. So I don't assume that history just gets better and better.
Do you mean like the idea of how oppositional energy tends to replicate? Is that what you're?
Well, that I see it in terms of like the progress, perhaps that uh, after during the civil rights era of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act, I mean, I think there was probably some elation, although things didn't just get better overnight for people of color in this country. But I mean, clearly there came a point where other folks resented the progress that people of color made. And we saw that heavily with affirmative action. And I get all over analytical. I'm actually an Enneagram 9, but I mean, I guess my 5 is coming out when I say, well, I guess the difference is that with those issues, we're talking about people's jobs and college admissions. And as long as I'm not taking anybody's job, I guess I'm okay. But still, like, I think I see these parallels when it seems like any group, whether it's women, ethnic, religious minorities make progress, there's this period where people start getting defensive or push back people that aren't part of those groups and get resentful. Like, why are we celebrating Muslim holidays now? What's this about? So people just have a tendency to want to react and go backwards. And so that's what I worry about is if we, but you can't just not fight for what you believe in. I know, can't fight for progress.
Well, we're seeing it today with Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
It pushed and pushed and pushed, and now pushing back. And
right.
I heard it. Actually, I just heard it I've heard it before, but I heard it on a podcast an hour ago I was listening to, where it's, if someone's in power, they see equality as them actually being lower. It's the wrong word. The word escapes me, but it's basically, even if you're in power and somebody is just pushing to be equal to you, mm-hmm. it's a threat. Mm-hmm. And you see yourself as the oppressed mm-hmm. at that point. That's kind of what I'm looking for. So
yeah, because everything's such a zero-sum game that right, we can't all have it.
But it's really not.
No. No.
It's really not. So what haven't I asked you that you want to share with us?
I know. From listening to prior episodes, I knew that question was coming, and I tried to think of something.
Already knew.
Well, I thought of it. I was listening to another episode, and I thought, well, I can't plan for it because it depends on what other questions you ask me. So,
that's true. That's true.
I wonder if a question I wish I were asked would be to talk about how differently my life turned out than what I anticipated. You started off by talking about the 90s, which weren't a bad time. And I was very lucky that I grew up when I did, and that the family that God blessed me with was all accepting. But for the grandparents that passed on, and maybe I can be optimistic and say they would have come around by now if they were in their 90s themselves. But I've been very blessed. And at the same time, though, I really 25 years ago when I was in high school, could not have imagined the life that I have. The pandemic was actually kind of a breeze, since it's just my husband and I and our dog and our cat. And that, I mean, we absolutely love each other, and we have this wonderful home here that we've created, and we're able to just enjoy dinners together, and we go places. And I never imagined that. I actually thought that maybe I'd have to become a priest or a Christian brother, which is like a priest but teaches in schools. I thought about all these other things, but I never could have imagined just this very ordinary life that I have. And it's just remarkable. So it makes me very happy.
Wow. Why couldn't you imagine it? Just because you didn't see it? Does that go back to
I didn't see it. Yeah. I mean, there was Will and Grace.
Vision for it.
Yeah. I remember Will and Grace. And I mean, they're very funny, and they were so witty, and I'm not that. So I didn't picture living in this cool apartment in New York that hey, that'd be great. But, I didn't see how that was going to happen. I wasn't anything like the character Jack that was, more on the flamboyant side. I wasn't even that much like Will, although, I mean, there are parallels, but I mean, I just didn't see that whole life when people talk about a lifestyle, I think that's what the word lifestyle is sort of pejorative from the LGBTQ perspective, because it's part of like who you are. With the gender issue, like I don't understand. Maybe there are people who are of a certain race, perhaps, but they've socialized with other races their whole lives. They went to a school that was a different, it was basically majority different race, and maybe they just don't feel like whatever, they don't feel like a white kid or something because they went to a predominantly black school, or vice versa, or something like that. So what's the big deal if you're, a woman and you just feel like a guy, or vice versa, or I don't know, like, yeah, the shows, the TV shows, the movies, all that stuff that I watched back in the 90s that I would have seen and everywhere I looked, made it seem like this, uh, just a lifestyle where people were funny and had good sense of style, and it was definitely not the awkward guy I was.
I think that's in the fear that people have towards things they don't understand. I think what gets lost in there are the kids. Like, I'm not, do it for the kids. But there's kids growing up and they're, high school, college, and we all do it. You look for people who are like you, and a lot of times that ends up, maybe family or friends, but it's also in the media. You're looking to see yourself as some sort of normal. And I think the expansion of what you see in media, social media, that sort of thing, I think in the grand scheme, it's got to help, just so, for if nothing else, from a mental health standpoint, that people look around and are like, all right, I'm not crazy. This is, there's other people out there like me. You mentioned the Enneagram, and I think that's been opening. Julie's done much more research on it than I have. Like, I've just dabbled a little bit, but it is like when you
like that you say dabbled like it's magic.
Yes.
The dark art of Enneagrams.
I've had some spells cast on me or something. But where you're reading something in a book and it was like, oh my God, this is me. Like, there's some comfort to that, to be like, oh, other people are like me. And there's, with the Enneagram, it's basically, there's 9 different types of me, and like, or people out there. You kind of fall in and you're like, this is why I do this, or this is why I do this. And it's just, there's some comfort to it. So to expand that out, to be able to watch a show and see somebody who's like, oh, they're kind of like me, and this is normal. Like, it can't help but be helpful and healthy.
So powerful.
I sure hope so. My kids, whenever they use the word weird, it's like I go to town. I'm like, what is weird? You're centering yourself as normal. What is weird? What are you actually saying here? You're saying they're different in this way and I'm different in this way. Let's get really granular about what that means, because we're not going to use weird as this like insulting thing. Your sister's weird because she's, it's like, but I think that is, I go to town on it because I feel so passionate about, I'm a lifelong connection addict. And when you get to know someone's story, it rearranges all the boxes. Like, there's no more boxes of what's normal because we're all so unique and so individual. And I think our need to belong wants to cast someone out based on whatever rules we've memorized that our in-group has said are in. But it's like, well, that's ridiculous. Why are there any rules? Like, we are all just walking each other home here. We're all just, our breaths and our lives and our relationships are way more fragile than we can possibly imagine. Like, why do we waste time? I don't know. I'm just getting all worked up because this idea of seeing difference is really important to me. And I just want to keep growing it. I have lots more room to grow. But I'm an enthusiastic student.
While Julie and I were talking to Joe the other night, we went in a direction, and I totally forgot to ask him a couple questions that was on my list, and I thought were important questions, at least important questions that I wanted to hear about. So hopefully you do too. So I asked Joe to come back a couple days later after the initial interview with Julie, and here is what he had to say. Joe, thanks for coming back on and helping me out with the question I forgot to ask.
No problem.
I remember back when you and Julie were working together, and she was telling me about you, and you had done some research through the Bible and other sources, just kind of wrestling with who you were versus who other people might be saying that you were, or versus what the Bible actually said. Do you mind just giving a little synopsis of that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as a Christian from my whole life, and I even went to it was a Catholic school from really preschool on up through first year of college. Um, I religion was part of everyday um, class, and so I was always intrigued, and as I came to realize I was gay, and paid attention to what folks on all sides were saying about the issue. I would hear people quote scripture, and usually it wasn't people who were supportive of gay folks. So I listened to it, and I'd start to I'd start to ask myself, what are they quoting? What are they? And so I started to read those parts of scriptures, which if obviously if you're not interested in the issue, why would you ever go to Leviticus 18:22? It's I mean, that part of the Old Testament is full of rules, and it's dense, and some of them don't make any sense because we live in a totally different world today. And so when I started reading about some of these, and even the things that Paul the Apostle talks about in the New Testament in his letters, um, not Paul the Apostle, but Paul in his letters, goes back to the holiness code in Leviticus, where it says man should not lie with a man as he would with a woman. And of course, there are different translations of that, but that's the gist of it. And I, as I read about it, I was so fortunate that I was raised in the faith tradition of reading the scriptures contextually. In other words, in the context of what was going on historically, because I was that precocious high school kid going, wait a minute, where if there's Adam and Eve and then they had two sons, Cain and Abel, where did everybody else come from? Like, did Eve have some sort of relations with one of her sons? Ew, what's going on here? And then where are the dinosaurs? I had so many questions, and there's a creation story, but then there's another completely different creation story right after that in Genesis. So the precocious teenager was very lucky that I had teachers, scripture teachers from high school and in college that were able to guide me to understanding that you could also, and people disagree on this, but you could also read the scriptures in the context of the history of the moment. And for instance, with what you read in Leviticus, understand it was helpful for me to understand that people didn't men and women even didn't have the kind of relationships that we do now, certainly consensual. It wasn't normal to court each other, or to court for men to even court women like they do today. And certainly when two men were having any sort of relations, it was oftentimes more incestuous, and sometimes, well, often even rape. It was, so that when you start to read the translations, you realize like they're using words that are used elsewhere in the Bible that actually are used to mean incest. So
It's interesting to me. One, I guess from a Levitical standpoint, if you're Christian, Jesus fulfilled the law, and really those don't pertain to us anymore.
right,
I mean, when it really comes down scripturally, because there's a lot of stuff in there that was just, it kept them
right,
alive. Touching the skin of an unclean animal was, they didn't know what a germ was
right.
back then. So they just knew that people tended to die when you ate undercooked food or you ate, things like that. I know one place I wanted to go was, and I've said this, in my Christian deconstruction, I've kind of hit a foundation of, I believe in God and I believe in Jesus. And I think ultimately that relationship's about love, and just, you can build from the church and anything past there. What I've heard in relation to LGBTQ is a sense of that's between them and God, which I think buried in that is, this is a sin. You're going to the bad place, but that's between you and God. I'll love you anyway. Does that sentiment strike you in any way?
It somehow seems incompatible that God, who we believe is perfect, because that's the very definition of God, could create something so detestable. And so I think it gets at a question. This is, I realize there's still people who disagree on this, but once a person arrives at a place where they realize it's not a choice to be gay or to be LGBTQ, to have to feel different like that. If you believe it's a choice, then I guess it's a decision, and I don't know what to say about that. But for those of us that have lived through it, you realize it's like I tried. I didn't know where this came from, and then I realized it was just part of who I am. Like, I don't know, being having being right-handed. I don't know, but so if I remember having a wise teacher say, "Joe, God created you this way. He loves you, and that's that." So so it does seem incompatible to think that you know you would be judged for being created a certain way.
I'll take that a step further, and if this gets too uncomfortable,
No
let me know.
problem.
But I've heard it taught that yes, people are born gay, but that is their air quotes cross to bear, and that it shouldn't be acted
Right.
on. Um, Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's I tried to toe that sort of the Catholic line in a way too. I mean, because the Catholic Church, um, I believe I'm paraphrasing this right, teaches that it's not a choice, that you are born gay, and that you should just remain celibate. I shouldn't say just, because there's nothing wrong with that. But and I did that. I mean, until I did not have sex until I was married, and very much believe. And so I lived through my whole 20s, teens, 20s, up until I met my husband in my early 30s. And uh, it was so. I mean, as I was teaching Sunday school, even for 10 years, in my 20s and early 30s, even a child could explain that things like murder and torture, lying, that these are sinful behaviors, and a child could explain why and understand why they are harmful to others and to ourselves. But I really struggle after all these years and plenty of thinking and reflecting and prayerful understanding. It's hard for me to grasp how loving somebody is harmful to other people.
No, and I agree, and I think it's I don't know. I may be oversimplifying it, but it seems like it's just a fear of something different.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And
and that's
I don't know.
what's
I don't know what to say about
so
that.
interesting is that our my marriage is like on a day-to-day basis pretty boring. I mean, and I mean, like our daily lives are pretty ordinary. I mean, we both work from home remotely, but we're on totally different floors, and we just get up and work. And Jamie comes down and has lunch and goes back upstairs. Like, hi, we might have two words, and then so it's yeah. A lot of times it's just coordinating schedules, and just like a lot of other people.
Right. It's just
Yeah,
normal. It's
yeah.
normal. And that's it. And I think the thing that I lost my train of thought on earlier, but it came back to me was, and you just kind of touched on it, is the Bible talks about a lot of things over and over and over again. This isn't one of them. There's some, I figure anything, there's some obscure passages that can be translated in different ways. If this was if this was a major issue that people should really be focusing on, I think it would be clearer in the Bible that, hey, this is wrong. It's not. So I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, and I wish that I respect there are people who are gay, straight, cisgender, non-binary, all different kinds that do and do not have faith or different faiths. But I wish that for LGBTQ people like myself who feel very comfortable otherwise as a Christian, that we could still embrace Scripture and embrace faith. Because I mean, when we were married by a Presbyterian minister in Charlottesville, Virginia, who asked if we'd like any sort of readings, reflections, whatever, and I said yes, please. Micah 6:8 has always been a favorite passage for me. I love Micah the prophet, because Micah wasn't, unlike other prophets, preaching to the elite. He was preaching to the regular folks out in, who knows where, but not in the urban elites. And Micah 6:8 was about acting. Was what does God want? God doesn't want you to be giving gifts and offerings, but rather to act justly. Love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And so, I mean, I'm all about social justice, and I look at forgiveness is the thing that for love and forgiveness, as you said, Steve, is the thing that you see over and over and over again, which is hard enough, frankly. There's like the challenges of scripture, the challenges that Jesus gives us are hard enough without all these other rules. So
yeah, exactly. And I have enough to worry about with just what's going on inside of me. I don't really need to worry about what's going on anywhere else. So no, Joe, I appreciate you popping back on to answer those. I can't believe I forgot to ask you the other night, because that was one of the forerunning questions I had, but we got flowing in a different direction.
I'm so glad you did, Steve.
It.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Joe, and really appreciate his time. Next week, I'm going to be releasing an interview I'm doing with Dr. Tracy Benson. He works at UNC Charlotte, here just a couple minutes down the road from me. He wrote a book called Unconscious Bias in Schools, and his research focuses on addressing structural and systematic racism in K-12 school systems. He's been a teacher, a principal, researcher, author. Should be a really good conversation to add to this little series on social issues that I'm doing. So thank you, and I will see you next week.